The Rangers add some size and strength by acquiring 6'5" defenseman Carson Soucy at the trade deadline. We talk about why this deadline was mostly a win for the Blue Shirts.
You're Locked on the New York Rangers, your daily podcast on the New York Rangers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, Blue Shirts fans, to episode number 1262 of the Locked On New York Rangers podcast. I'm your host, John Chick. Just want to thank you guys, as always, for making Locked On New York Rangers your first listen every day. We are free and available on all platforms, including YouTube. And today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. And we are, of course, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So I am back from vacation, and just to kind of bring everybody up to speed between what happened from the last time we talked and today, obviously in our most recent, breaking news episode of Locked On New York Rangers, we covered the trade that saw the Rangers deal away Ryan Lindgren and Jimmy Vesey in exchange for Urho Vaakanainen and Calvin DeHaan, as well as a second-round pick and a fourth-round pick. So if you want my thoughts on that trade, you can go back a couple of episodes and find it there. Should be pretty easy to find. Rangers, though, they were very busy right up until the 0 hour at the trade deadline. I think this is mostly a good deadline for the Rangers. I feel like it's kind of tricky when you're one of those in-between teams, those fringe playoff teams, as the Rangers currently are. They're about to play the Senators here today, and that's obviously a massive game. Both those teams trying to get into the dance, trying to get into the postseason. Huge weekend for the Rangers. They got the Senators, and then they got the Blue Jackets, two of the teams that they're competing with to try to get into the playoffs. But, Rangers, look, they made 8 trades, I believe it was, in the span of exactly 3 months between December 6th and the NHL trade deadline. So it's been a crazy 90 or so days as a fan of this team for sure. But one of the biggest things that they did at the trade deadline, and I think both literally and figuratively, the biggest move that they made was the acquisition of defenseman Carson Soucy from the Vancouver Canucks. The second deal that the Rangers have made with the Canucks in recent months here. And they get Soucy for what I think is a very, very, very reasonable price of just a third-round draft pick. The Rangers earlier in the day dealt Riley Smith to the Vegas Golden Knights in exchange for a third-round pick and Brendan Brisson. And we'll talk a little bit about Riley Smith in just a second because obviously, he wasn't here for that long, but we'll have some final thoughts about Riley Smith. But they then turned around and took that third-round pick that they got in the Riley Smith deal and flipped it over to the Vancouver Canucks and brought in Carson Soucy. And to me, that's a net gain going from Riley Smith to Carson Soucy. I just think he's more of what they need. And with Smith being gone, I think that opens up the door for your Brandon Hoffmans, your Brett Berards, these young players that need to get some run with the Rangers. And for the most part, I think have looked fairly good with the Rangers. And of course, I'm still getting caught up with the Rangers the last couple of games. I was on vacation with my family, did not see all these most recent 3 games in their entirety. So again, getting caught up there. But I do like the idea of opening up some opportunities for guys like Berard and Hoffman. And I think this trade definitely does that, or rather the Smith trade does that. And now you also turn around and use that third-round pick they got for Smith to bring in Carson Soucy. But let's talk about the man of the hour here, Carson Soucy himself. Obviously, a lot of moving parts here. But, first of all, the first thing that catches your attention when it comes to Soucy is obviously the size. 6'5", 208 pounds, so just an absolute giant. And along with Parsonen, I feel like the Ranger fans that want this team to get bigger and tougher and more physical and stronger and all that good stuff, you pretty much got your wish at this trade deadline here. They added a couple of guys with size, and with Soucy, a veteran player at this point in his NHL career, 30 years old, 7 seasons in the NHL. He did not become an NHL regular until he was 25 years old, which is not ancient, but I think it's a little bit later than obviously we see most impact players become NHL regulars. Part of the reason for that, you would have to think, is the fact that he was a 5th-round draft pick. So he was taken later than most guys that become, standout players in the NHL, but drafted by the Minnesota Wild in the 5th round of the 2013 NHL draft, went number 137 overall, 3 seasons with the Wild, 2 with the Kraken, and now basically 1.5 with the Vancouver Canucks before this trade sends him to the New York Rangers. But 349 career regular season games for Soucy, 26 goals, 58 assists, so 84 points. He's also a plus 58 for his career, 427 block shots, 547 hits. So again, just an absolute giant. And to me, one of the things that kind of caught my attention right away, apart from, the size and the strength and the physicality and all that good stuff, is the fact that this to me seems like a prime example of a GM buying low on a player. I mentioned a second ago that I thought getting Soucy for a third-round pick was more than reasonable. And when you combine that with the fact that this appeared to be very much a seller's market, I think the Rangers absolutely stole this guy from the Canucks. And I realize, and a lot of you are probably going to point this out as well, that this has not been Carson Soucy's best season of his career. On the contrary, it's probably the worst season of his NHL career. And there's going to be some people that look at that and say, oh, this guy's on the downside of his career. He's on the back nine. He's on the wrong side of 30 and all this stuff. And here go the Rangers again, bringing in a veteran that's past his prime. To allow me to kind of make some counterpoints there, 30 years old is not 37 or 38 years old. This guy has a lot of hockey left. He's going to be in the NHL for quite some time. And again, buying low. That is the name of the game here. That's what the Rangers did. That's what the Rangers pulled off. They bring in a defenseman who, by and large, has been considered, a very solid blue liner for pretty much the entirety of his NHL career, having a little bit of a down season this year. I think the Rangers feel that they can get this guy, bring him in now, get him for less than what he would have cost in other seasons, and hopefully help him regain some form. And some people have already talked about the idea of potentially pairing him with Adam Fox. I like that idea quite a bit. I feel like that would be an upgrade for Fox on Ryan Lindgren. And I mean, think about that too. The Rangers, when they traded Lindgren away, and granted, there were a couple of different moving parts for this deal, but for the most part, the meat and potatoes of that trade with Colorado was Ryan Lindgren for a second rounder. Now you take a third rounder and you bring in Carson Soucy, and you can make a very, very compelling case that Soucy is an upgrade on Lindgren. And Lindgren got you a second rounder, and Soucy only cost you a third rounder. So that's good stuff all around there by the New York Rangers. And again, buying low, that's the name of the game here. The Rangers feel like they can have him, turn things around a little bit. He's a big hitter, he's a physical player, obviously big time size. And the other thing that I like here, and I think a lot of other Ranger fans will like this as well, is the very simple fact that they are not committing themselves long-term to Carson Soucy. Soucy right now is in year 2 of a 3-year contract that carries a cap hit of just $3.25 million per season. That's not too shabby at all, especially when you consider that this might be the guy that ends up being paired with Adam Fox, for the rest of this year, maybe the playoffs this year if the Rangers can get in, and then certainly next season as well. You're not locked in long-term here. The price is more than reasonable. It's not going to handcuff you as far as other moves that you want to make in the offseason, bring in other free agents, making other trades, whatever it might be. And Soucy will be in his very early 30s when this contract expires. Now, will he be a Ranger beyond that? Could go either way. We'll see. Obviously, it's going to depend quite a bit on how he fares with the Rangers. And I think the Rangers, when this contract does expire, they want to be careful because you don't want to make the mistake of, overextending veteran defenseman, signing a defenseman into his, mid to late 30s. That might not be good business. But again, I think that's a bridge that you can kind of cross when you get there. For the time being, I think this is a great deal. I think it's a great contract that Carson Soucy is on, more than reasonable. And something else that I'll throw out there too. I also feel like this is a move that the Rangers made with an eye on this season, but an even bigger eye on next season. It's very similar to the JT Miller trade in that respect. I said the same thing when the Rangers dealt for JT Miller. Yes, they would love to still make the playoffs this year. Yes, they would hope that JT Miller can maybe propel them over the finish line in terms of at least making it to the playoffs. And that's all well and good. But JT Miller was acquired for the Rangers to retool this roster and go into next season with a clean slate and hopefully, able to turn things around fairly quickly and possibly even rejoin the NHL's elite. I think it's a similar thing here. Now, obviously, Carson Soucy, it's not as big of a trade as JT Miller. He doesn't have the name recognition. Frankly, he's just not as good of a player as JT Miller, but that's okay. For what Carson Soucy is, he does it very well. Somebody that's just a very solid defenseman and obviously gives you a lot of size and hopefully a little bit of a mean streak as well. And again, you have not overextended yourself either in terms of the years on the contract or the dollars on the contract. So I think most Ranger fans will probably like this deal. For what it's worth, Soucy has a full no trade clause for this season, which he had to waive to come to the Rangers. And obviously he did that. Next season, he will have a 12-team no trade clause. I think that's basically a moot point because I think the Rangers will be a good enough team next year that they're not going to be looking to trade away UFAs the way that they did this year. But if it comes to that situation where the Rangers are not having a good year next year and you feel like you need to move Carson Soucy at the trade deadline, and at that point he will be an impending UFA, then certainly you can do that. There's 12 teams he can block a trade to, but obviously that doesn't limit your ability to strike a deal with this team or that team or, whatever it might be. But this is what we got from Chris Drury as far as the acquisition of Carson Soucy. We think there's a lot of possibilities with Carson, whether it's pairing with Schneid's or Foxy or Will Borgen, or even having him on the right side at some point. We'll see how it plays out. I'm glad we were able to get him. I was excited about the term, excited about the number. He's not a rental. He's someone we could have in for the rest of the year and next year. I just like the overall game, the size, the skating, the sense, how he defends. We were able to do some homework on him the last couple of weeks, and we're excited to get him with a piece we got in the Riley Smith trade. And yeah, I think that pretty much says it all. Again, I do like this trade for a multitude of reasons. And as for Riley Smith, we might as well talk about him here before we shift the page to a couple of other things, including the 2-year extension for Urho Vaakanainen. Riley Smith, it just didn't work out. He becomes the latest in a very, very, very long line of different players that the Rangers have tried at that top line right wing spot where something just hasn't clicked. I don't think it's always on that individual player. Certainly Mika and Kreider have something to do with that as well. But Smith was here for 58 games, 10 goals, 19 assists, 29 points, -1. I just didn't think he was all that dynamic of a player. I don't have anything against Riley Smith personally, and him getting to go back to Vegas. I'm sure he'll like that. He obviously won a Stanley Cup there. I feel like there's probably worse landing spots for Riley Smith than that. And obviously the Rangers trade him out of conference. But I just never understood the Rangers' obsession, what felt like an obsession with acquiring him. We've been hearing rumors about the Rangers wanting to sign Riley Smith and trade for Riley Smith for no less than half a decade. And I never really understood why. And now that he's played half a season here, I really, really don't understand why. Again, it's like I said in the past, he's the most just there player that we've ever seen on the Rangers. I just don't think he really stands out in this way or in that way, and had just a very kind of blah tenure with the Rangers. It's not like he was terrible. He'd chip in every now and then, but just such an average player. I just don't know why this team was so obsessed with him for as long as they were. But all the best to Riley Smith in Vegas. We're going to keep everything rolling here in just a second. Like I said, I want to shift our attention to Urho Vaakanainen. Also going to talk in just a little bit about Chris Kreider and the very simple fact that he still is on the New York Rangers. We will do all that in just a second. All right, we just want to take a minute to let everybody know that today's episode of Locked On New York Rangers is brought to you by FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there is no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. It's awesome using FanDuel's live betting feature because it keeps every moment of the game exciting. Whether you're backing your team for a late game rally or picking a player to hit a clutch 3, you're never going to feel like you missed your chance. Plus, the app is easy to use, and when you win, you get paid instantly. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, let's go ahead and keep everything rolling here on Locked On New York Rangers. A huge shout out to the everydayers, as always, for sticking with this podcast throughout the entire season and the offseason and the postseason and all that good stuff. Rangers a little bit later here today on Saturday, going to be in action against the Ottawa Senators at 12:30. An absolutely enormous game for both teams, so definitely not going to be missing that. We'll see how Soucy looks in his Ranger debut. But for right now, I actually want to shift our attention to another move that happened on trade deadline day. Not a trade, but rather an extension. The Rangers come to a 2-year extension agreement with Urho Vaakanainen. Vaakanainen gets $1.55 million per season, so he gets a little bit of a pay bump on his current deal, which was paying him $1.1 million per season. And of course, Vaakanainen came over to the Rangers in the trade that sent Jacob Trouba to the Anaheim Ducks. The Rangers got Vaakanainen as well as a 4th-round pick. At the end of this season, Vaakanainen was slated to become an RFA with arbitration rights, but that's all a moot point now with this 2-year extension. He is now under contract for what I would say is a pretty reasonable price. Right now, the NHL minimum salary is $775,000 per season. I'm not sure if that's going up slightly next year because obviously we know the salary cap, is going up in future seasons. But you've got a guy here that is under contract for just a shade above that. Even if it stays at $775K, you're basically talking about just that, $775K over the league minimum. And I think that's completely fine to spend on a guy that profiles as your number 6 defenseman. For what it's worth, I know some Ranger fans are going to be interested in this. There is no trade protection of any kind when it comes to Vaakanainen. So if the Rangers want to trade him, they can send him anywhere they want, and he obviously has no say in the matter. But bottom line, I don't expect him to be traded. I like this move quite a bit. Vaakanainen came over to the Rangers when they were in complete turmoil, and he was in kind of a weird spot too because he was actually still dealing with a minor injury at the time. So all these things are happening. You come over to the Rangers in exchange for the team captain and somebody that, despite his play slipping in recent seasons, I feel like he was still mostly popular in that Ranger locker room. And you come in to replace him, and you're injured when you get here, and you have to step onto this team that was basically just playing terrible hockey at the time. And I think Vaakanainen has mostly held it down, a fairly physical defenseman. Just 30 games with the Rangers, 2 goals, 7 assists. He's a +2, 26 block shots, and 14 hits. But I like this kind of mindset, this kind of path that the Rangers have taken here, where, they make the trades. They deal away Trouba. They bring in Vaakanainen. They also deal away Kakko. They bring in Borgen. They now have both Vaakanainen and Borgen extended under contract for seasons to come here. So that tells you that there's some conviction behind these trades. They're not doing these moves just to do them. They actually like the defenseman that they brought in. And overall, I think the two of them have mostly held it down. I've been a big fan of Will Borgen and just his steady, consistent play. And I think with Vaakanainen, it's almost like Borgen Jr. in a way. Like I don't think he's quite on Borgen's level. And certainly their cap hits do reflect that. But I think, Vaakanainen, for somebody that's going to be on the third pair and get third pair minutes, he's just fine. I think he's overall just been steady. And this is something else that we've talked about in the past, but the role of the number 6 defenseman, in a way, the less you talk about this player on a podcast such as this, or the less you talk about it with your friends or whatever it might be, the less the number 6 defenseman comes up in conversation, probably the better of a job that individual is doing, because you're not going to have a superstar as your number 6 defenseman. Just not going to happen. The salary cap is such that there's just no way to make that happen. And teams, whether it's the Rangers or anybody else, you're going to need to save money in certain spots on your roster. And certainly 6 defensemen is one of them. You just hope that it's somebody that is consistent and maybe, I guess, in some ways doesn't really stand out all that much. And I think Vaakanainen has kind of fit that description thus far with the Rangers. It's crazy because if he plays the rest of his contract with the Rangers, which I think there's a good chance that he will, then he will be the Ranger number 6 defenseman. And you might rank them in different order. Maybe you have him at number 5 or whatever. It doesn't really matter. Third pair defenseman, though, he'll be here for 2.5 years. And that's an eternity for somebody in his role as a number 6 defenseman, especially with the Rangers. Because think about how many different guys have played on that third pairing over the last handful of years. I'm not going to go through all the different names right now, but certainly I'm sure you can come up with some true Ranger legends there, like, Jared Tenorti or Jack Johnson or whoever else you want to throw out there. But I think Vaakanainen, solid for the role that he plays. Nothing wrong with this. I feel like most Ranger fans were on board with this signing. Maybe a few of them were kind of whatever about it. And I can understand that too. There's nothing about Vaakanainen's game that screams superstar or really jumps off the page. But again, just steady and consistent and somebody that doesn't seem to make a lot of mistakes and plays a decently physical brand of hockey as well. The other thing that kind of popped into my head when I saw this extension being done for Vaakanainen was that I think there's a good chance when you look at the term here, the fact that it's a 2-year extension, that the Rangers very well might see Vaakanainen as a placeholder for some of their young draft picks who have yet to make their NHL debut. Guys like, namely, Drew Fortescue and EJ Emery, both promising young defensemen. Fortescue, a former third-rounder, who is very much impressed at Boston College and also at the World Juniors. And then you've got Emery as well, EJ Emery, and he was a first-round pick for the Rangers this past season. His college career currently underway at North Dakota. So he's just getting started. Those guys, I mean, their debut, I don't think is imminent or anything like that. Fortescue seems to be further along, obviously, than Emery because he was drafted a couple of years before Emery. But sooner or later, those guys are going to start mixing in. They'll be with the Wolfpack. They'll be up with the Rangers. They'll be getting their feet wet. And around that time, that's about the same time I would imagine when Vaakanainen's contract will be expiring. And again, same thing we talked about with Soucy a minute ago. You can cross that bridge when you get to it. Do you want to keep Vaakanainen in the fold? Or by that point, do you feel good enough about guys like Fortescue, guys like Emery, where you say, okay, you know what, we're good. Our future's good at defenseman. We're okay to let Vaakanainen walk, or we're even okay to trade Vaakanainen and get something back for him. And that's another thing here that I think will alleviate concerns from Ranger fans. I don't think Vaakanainen would be all that difficult of a player to trade. Again, small cap hit. You're not going to get a major return for Vaakanainen, but if you ever feel like there's a situation where he's kind of getting squeezed out of lineup, whether it's by your own homegrown young defenseman or whether it's by another defenseman that you trade for, that you acquire via free agency, whatever the case might be, again, I feel like Vaakanainen would be a very, very tradable player. You take the 4th round pick or whatever it might be, and you move on from there. And, no hard feelings. But I think for right now, this is a solid move for the Rangers. They get Vaakanainen under contract. You don't have to deal with any tense contract negotiations in the offseason, the threat of it possibly going to arbitration. It's a done deal. He's here. He's locked up for the next 2 years at, once again, what I think is a very, very reasonable cost for Urho Vaakanainen. So good stuff there. I like that move. You guys let me know what you feel. I mean, maybe there's people that don't like the Carson Soucy trade. Maybe there's people that would have rather seen the Rangers trade Vaakanainen away or not give him 2 years, whatever it might be, whatever the case might be. Let me know how you're feeling about these moves. But in just a minute, we're going to shift gears a little bit, and we're actually going to turn our attention to a couple of moves that the Rangers did not make, including a potential trade of Chris Kreider. And like I said, we will get to that in just a second. All right, so Chris Kreider is still a New York Ranger, at least for now. I've been saying all along, really since everything kind of went south this season and all these flurries of trades were happening, and we saw Chris Kreider's name at the top of that memo, along with Jacob Trouba, when Chris Drury was looking to shake up the core of the Ranger roster. The 2 names at the top of the list were Jacob Trouba and Chris Kreider. And obviously, Trouba was not long for the Rangers after that memo went out. I mean, how much longer was he here? Maybe like 2 weeks, 3 weeks? It's hard to remember exactly, but he wasn't here for much longer after that. Chris Kreider is still here. I've been saying, though, pretty much ever since that memo went out, that I do not think Chris Kreider, and I'm going to stand by this, I do not think Chris Kreider is on the Rangers opening night roster next season. Some people are going to love that. Some people are going to hate that. And then there's going to be some people that have some mixed feelings, such as myself, some people that are kind of in between. I don't hate the idea, though. And I honestly, I mean, if they trade Kreider in the offseason, I'm going to completely understand where they're coming from, because it just feels like things have kind of gone south between Kreider and the Rangers. His play on the ice, his kind of frosty relationship with upper management off the ice, that's all been reported, and it just doesn't seem like things are all good right now. Again, they're looking to kind of retool rather than rebuild, and I think a part of that probably is moving on from Chris Kreider in the offseason. I thought there was at least a chance that Kreider would be dealt at the trade deadline, but I didn't expect it to happen for a couple of reasons. One of them is that he's been dealing with this back injury off and on, so that limits his trade value. Another one is that, obviously the Rangers have had a lot of things happen. They've shook the boat, rocked the boat quite a bit, multiple times this season, trading guys like Philip Edel and Jacob Trouba and Capo Caco, guys that are roster mainstays, and sending them out of town. And we saw how badly that affected this Ranger team. And now you're in a spot where this team actually has gotten back into the playoff chase. You think of all the things that have gone wrong this season and all the drama and all the ups and downs, and what feels like more downs than ups, if we're being completely honest here. And yet, against all odds, they are right there in the playoff picture. So to now trade away a long tenured member like Chris Kreider, could that damage the locker room? Could that kind of send shockwaves through there? And then we're right back into this mess that we saw in November and December. Would it be worth it to do that even if that does happen? I mean, we don't really know the answers to those questions, but I feel like that's probably one of the biggest reasons why Kreider wasn't traded. The Rangers, per a couple of different reporters that were out there, on social media on deadline day, the Rangers were looking, or rather listening to offers on Chris Kreider as opposed to actively shopping him. And I think that makes sense. Again, they didn't seem overly motivated to move him for all those reasons that I just mentioned. The minimal return, the fact that it might mess with the Rangers' current players. So for that reason, I'm not surprised that he made it through the trade deadline. But again, I think this offseason, there's a very, very good chance that Chris Kreider is gone. He can only block a trade to half the teams in the NHL. The other half, all it takes is one dance partner, and you can send him on his way. And I think that's what the Rangers are going to do. We will see. And it's just crazy to me that we've gotten to a point as Ranger fans here, and I don't want to speak for everybody, but I think most Ranger fans kind of look at it and just say, yeah, okay. Like if Kreider gets traded this offseason, you see the kind of season that he's having right now. It's just been poor. He is getting older, obviously. He's got the back injuries. Yeah, I don't know. I think a lot of people are ready for this team to go in a different direction. Obviously, you're not going to trade every single player on the roster, although it kind of feels like that's what the Rangers have done this season. But no, I mean, he'll be on his way, most likely in the offseason. Again, I think it made sense for him to survive the trade deadline. But, sometimes it's just time. It's just as simple as that. It's crazy to think that we are less than a year removed from what was bordering on a legendary Chris Kreider playoff performance, what he did against the Carolina Hurricanes in Game 6. The Rangers are down 3-1 in that game, up 3-2 in the series. The threat of the reverse sweep by the Canes is becoming very, very real. The Rangers were up 3-0 in the series. It's down at 3-2, and we see this amazing performance by Chris Kreider. The Rangers are down 3-1 in Game 6 on the road, and he gets a natural hat trick in the third period to put them on top 4-3. Believe it was Goodrow that got the empty netter to seal the deal there and send the Rangers to the conference final, but that was less than a year ago, and now we've all gotten to a point, and we talked about this with Broadway Block when we did our crossover episode with those guys. It's kind of like, okay, well, if Kreider has to be traded, then Kreider has to be traded, and that's kind of where we've all gotten to. But something else that I think is really crazy here, too, on the flip side of that, is that Kreider's still a Ranger. And this season is still alive compared to, contrary to what a lot of people would have you believe, the Rangers are very much alive in this playoff chase. Kreider still has a chance to kind of flip Ranger fans yet again because, man, awesome legendary performance by Kreider in the playoffs last year against the Canes, and Kreider's the man and all this stuff. This year, you see what he's done, which is a whole lot of nothing. And obviously not showing a whole ton of leadership. I don't think anybody on this team showed a lot of leadership when this team was 4-19. And now people are down on Kreider. Hey, you know what? If this team gets into the playoffs, if Kreider is strong down the stretch, if he gets back in the lineup and plays some good hockey, if he has another couple of big time showings in the playoffs, that's all it's going to take. We're all going to flip back the other way, and we're going to say, oh no, we got to keep Kreider for another year. Not all of us, but that's all it takes sometimes. That's all it takes to kind of sway the opinions of a fan base. And Kreider still does have that opportunity ahead of him, and I hope he realizes that. Because however you might feel about Kreider, and there's a lot of opinions out there, he's been here a long time. He's been a mainstay of Ranger hockey. He's been a part of a lot of winning teams. He's been a big part of a lot of deep playoff runs. He's had some big-time performances in the postseason over the years. He's been here for multiple parts of Ranger hockey. You don't want to see it just end completely in a meh way. Like, let's see Kreider, step on the gas down the stretch here. Once he gets back in the lineup, hopefully he can stay in the lineup, and let's see him do something in the playoffs. It can't just end with the Rangers, eking their way into the playoffs, but then losing in 5 games while Kreider gets, 1 goal and no assists in the 5 games. That can't be the way that Chris Kreider goes out, and I hope that he recognizes that as well. I hope so. Can't say for sure, but I hope that he has it in him to at least step on the gas and say that, it's not going to end this way for me with the New York Rangers. And who knows? Maybe he wants a fresh start with somebody else. Maybe he wants to remain a Ranger for the duration of his contract. We don't know, but he's going to be here for the rest of this season. Nothing else beyond that is guaranteed. And I hope Kreider, recognizes the importance of what's ahead of him and what's ahead of the Rangers here. We're talking about things that the Rangers did not do on trade deadline day. I want to address this as well. They did not trade for J.J. Peterka. I know a lot of Ranger fans were buying into the hype, buying into the trade rumors. There were a lot of conflicting reports out here. One NHL reporter says the Rangers are in on Peterka. Another says they clearly are not in on Peterka. I'll be honest here. I never really got my hopes up as far as a Peterka trade because why would the Sabres do that? The Sabres here have a 23-year-old center. He's in his 3rd full season of NHL action. really starting to come into his own this season. 51 points in 59 games this year. Bit of a breakout candidate, right? I mean, in a way, you could say he already has broken out. He's a homegrown player. They took him at the start of the second round a few years ago. And now he's beginning to be, a budding, if not a superstar, certainly a very solid contributing member of your franchise. Why would they trade him? He's 23 years old. He's still on his ELC, making six figures a year. He's an RFA after the season without arbitration rights. It just would make no sense. The only thing you could kind of point to where maybe it could make some sense is what was speculated out there. And I think this is more by fans than by reporters, but Peterka straight up for Lafreniere, because Buffalo has a boatload of cap space. They could easily handle the Lafreniere contract. And Peterka hasn't been in the league as long. I mean, even that, though, doesn't really make a lot of sense. Why would Buffalo not just stick with their homegrown kid that's playing very well for them? So that one just never really made a whole lot of sense for me. And, again, big story for the Rangers yesterday was some of the things they did not do. I know that there were names out there. And again, a lot of these are very much fan created, but Lafreniere, K'Andre Miller, Adam Fox, everybody throwing out these ideas. Those guys are all still here. And I don't really have a problem with any of that. I mean, K'Andre Miller, I feel like that could still go either way in the offseason, whether they bring him back or trade him. K'Andre Miller will get the Rangers a first-round pick. When you look at some of the deals that were made this trade deadline season, some of the returns that some of these guys were fetching, first-rounder for like Scott Lawton, I believe it was, and there were just middling defensemen that were pulling in second-round picks. I think K'Andre Miller could easily get you a first-rounder, and maybe that's an avenue the Rangers look to go down in the offseason. We'll see, and I think K'Andre certainly controls some of his own destiny with how he plays down the stretch here and in the playoffs if the Rangers make it, but we'll see. Nothing crazy happening with the Rangers as far as guys being traded away at the trade deadline. Homegrown, in-house big-name players being traded away. There was none of that on deadline day. There were a couple of other moves. We'll get to them on a future episode. We saw Eric Brandstrom traded for Abe Kubel. We also saw the Rangers acquire Brendan Breeson, so we'll talk about those guys in a future episode. Those are minor deals, though, compared to what we talked about today. And hopefully everybody's caught up now. We can move on to Rangers versus Senators today, and hopefully we're looking at a regulation win for the Rangers. But that'll do it for today, guys. Once again, if you'd like to get in touch with this podcast, please send an email to lockedonnyrangers@gmail.com. Definitely give us a follow on Twitter @jchick17, and definitely subscribe to Locked On New York Rangers YouTube channel. Thanks again, guys. I will see you next time.